I'm still working on a city exploration game where every building can be entered and everything is interactive. Last month, I finished playtesting the procedural NPCs, and after that I decided to take a little break from working on them and do something completely different. The reason is, I just recently tried a cozy game called Sushi Ben, and there are these moments in it where you get to eat sushi with your friends, which I found very wholesome. They aren't a part of any kind of challenge or puzzle, and they don't give you any rewards. Those moments are just there for the atmosphere and immersion, and I greatly enjoyed that. It instantly made me want to implement eating and drinking in Vantra City too. It would make sense to have those mechanics in the game anyway, because most sandbox games do have some form of consumption. But I also wanted to make them as immersive as possible, so you can just enjoy them regardless of the effects or rewards you get from the food or the drinks. In order to have eating and drinking mechanics, I first needed to implement food and drink items. Now, food is pretty straightforward, and I already have a few food items in the game, although right now there are too few and you can't really do anything with them. But in order to implement drinking, I would need to introduce liquids, which is what I decided to start with as the most challenging part of this whole set of features. Besides, after working on the NPCs for a year, I've been feeling pretty burnt out and felt like I needed to switch it up a bit. There's still work to do on them though, so I will be back to it soon. But before I get into it, a shout out to my patrons on Patreon. Thank you all for the support, I really appreciate it. Implementing liquids that can be poured, spilled, and mixed is not an easy task, so today I'd like to share how I approached it, what worked and what didn't, and what I settled on in the end. I initially tried to do a proper fluid simulation in Unreal Engine, but that has proven to be impractical. The biggest bottleneck of this approach turned out to be collisions. Calculating collisions for the liquid is expensive and doesn't get me the accuracy I need for small items like glasses and bottles, because Unreal's fluid systems were ultimately designed for things like waterfalls and fountains, not small containers. So I realized that I'd have to fake these fluid dynamics to get the effect that I wanted. The first step towards faking fluids was to borrow the technique for fake liquid in a container from Half-Life Alyx. The way I made it work was by adding an extra component to all my containers that represents the liquid inside and applying a special material to it that effectively cuts out a portion of the mesh that is supposed to be empty and adds a sine wave to emulate water agitation when the container moves. I won't go into too much detail on how it works, as it is rather standard and there are tutorials on this fake liquid material elsewhere. The main trick here is that the top portion of the liquid is not actually a surface. It is just the back face of the mesh that kind of looks like a water surface, but in reality it is hollow. This creates a few problems. First, the illusion falls apart when something penetrates the liquid. Second, the illusion only works perfectly when the material is opaque. This is why the bottles in Half-Life Alyx are not actually translucent. They are opaque and they simply refract a cube map of the environment. That's why they are kind of blurry. I've tried this approach too at first, but because my environment is fully procedural, I cannot create cube maps that are accurate enough. So the liquid looked more like paint than drinks. I have now changed the liquids to translucent, which kind of breaks the sharp distinction between the top and the sides due to the transparency, and also might create some sorting issues, but I feel like this still looks better overall. So it's a trade-off either way, but let me know what you think. Now that I have liquid inside the containers, I would like to be able to splash it and pour it. Normally the two are the same thing, but because I am not simulating the liquid accurately, I use two different particle systems for the two mechanics. First, there's splashing, which is what happens when the velocity of the container changes abruptly. When this velocity change is over a certain threshold, I spawn a particle system along the rim of the container that inherits the color and some other properties of the liquid to emulate the splash. I'm not really trying to achieve a realistic splashed liquid look, so the little droplets flying out, combined with the sound effect, works pretty well to convey a splash, in my opinion. But for pouring, I need something that better resembles a stream of liquid. I opted to use Unreal's metaball liquid simulation system for the stream. It's not perfect and I might still change it to something else, but for now it's the best solution I found. The pouring particle system is set up in a relatively simple way. It generates particles in a ring of a specific size, with an origin point and spread along that ring that I can set from the code. The ring is supposed to represent the rim of the container, so I set it to match the model. Every time the container moves, I calculate the lowest point on the rim and also the intensity of the pour depending on the angle at which it is held, and send those values to the particle system to make sure it creates the stream at the correct location. This particle system can only simulate particles in a limited volume that you can see marked here. That's why the stream tapers out at the end rather than just pouring down all the way to the ground like real liquid would. But that is yet another compromise that I have to make. Once I had the effect set up, I needed to implement the actual mechanics. The liquid should get consumed by pouring and splashing, leave stains where it drops, and add to the level of any container it drops into. Now, the shader effect that shows the level of the liquid only displays the relative fill level of the container as a portion of its height, so it knows nothing about the container's volume. And in order to pour from one container into another, I need to operate with volume, so I needed to tie these things together. That's why I decided to keep all my containers in a database where I can easily look up any information about each one. I started with glasses, then added bottles, but they are functionally the same. Each database entry for the container has a set of numbers that correspond to cone frustum sections that it consists of. If the numbers are absent, it is assumed that the container is a plain cylinder, so I can save some time entering numbers for those. But for complex shapes, like some of the bottles, I try to specify a set of frustums that somewhat accurately defines their shape. From this data, I calculate both the total volume of the liquid it can contain and the current level of fluid of a certain volume. The top entry for the shape is assumed to be the rim and used to determine the speed at which the liquid is consumed when pouring. That covers the consumption while pouring, but how do I know how much liquid to add and where? For that, I had to add a trace that calculates where the current stream will fall and actually simulates the effect at that spot after the right interval of time. Thankfully, Unreal has a built-in function that evaluates a ballistic trajectory out of the box and can tell me where and when my fluid will hit. It is normally used to calculate projectile impacts in shooter games, but apparently it works just as well for a stream of water. When this trace returns a hit, I spawn a decal and a little splash particle system at that location, and if it hits an NPC, I also attach the decal to its skeleton to make sure it stays on that spot even if they move, creating a stain. I will make the characters react to this interaction later on, and they'll probably get pretty annoyed, but for now, as you can see, they just silently judge me with their stares as I'm testing the mechanic. Now, if the stream hits another container object, this gets interesting. I want to add the liquid from the stream to that container, but for that I first need to determine if I hit the rim of the container and whether it's at the right angle. I know where the rim is for each container due to the data I've specified in the database that I mentioned before. So to find out whether the stream hit it, I do a quick calculation by checking whether a line along the hit direction intersects the circle that represents the rim, and that the angle between the hit normal and the up direction of the container is within 90 degrees, to make sure we're not hitting the container from the bottom. This calculation is not completely accurate and might give false positives in some specific cases, but because the container collisions are also rough and don't represent their shapes accurately, it's the best I can do. Works quite well in practice though. Then once a container is hit, I am adding the volume that I subtracted from the original container to the new one. This volume is of course proportional to the area of the original container's rim and the intensity of the pour, and like everything else, it's not a perfectly accurate calculation, but it looks reasonable. I've also added an overflow effect for when you try to fill a container that's already full. This one doesn't trace the liquid, so you can't fill another container with overflowing liquid, so no champagne tower, sorry. Another small detail that I've added is having the container's acceleration and velocity affect the pouring, so you can now throw the liquid out of the container. I just thought it would be fun to throw drinks in the NPC's faces, and I might even add a mission to do that. Shadows of Doubt has missions to throw food in people's faces after all. Although the thrown liquid doesn't travel as far as real liquid would, because it's constrained by the bounds of the simulation like I mentioned earlier, so it just fades out at a certain distance from the container. I also made sure that the drinks mix colors proportionally to their volume when you combine them. On top of that, there are drinks with special textures like glowing, metallic, and glittering ones. None of them are very realistic, of course, although I have heard of cocktails with edible glitter, but I just thought they would be fun to have. And these special drinks follow different rules for mixing. You can pour them into an empty glass or mix them with other special ones, but mixing them with plain liquid will instantly disable their special properties. This means I can have cocktail mixing and maybe even some sort of alchemy as game mechanics further down the line. That about covers the fluid mechanics that I now have in the game. They are all very fake, but lifelike enough to be fun to play around with. I also love how creative the community has been with their suggestions for more liquid interactions to add, like having fizzy drinks or drinks that don't mix with each other, being able to dye one of the pools by pouring a colored drink into it, or to fill a room with water by spilling too many bottles. But I think I'm done with this for now. I still have a lot of work to do on the NPCs and other game mechanics after all. Until next time, and stay creative!